there, and welcome. It's good to see you. I would like to start off by saying that I'm not a psychologist, nor am I in an institution to become one. Everything said today is merely speculation and opinion based on the information I've gathered. Adding to that, I will be talking in depth about a character named Aya from the game Mad Father. If you would like to stay spoiler-free, play the game for yourself, or at least watch a playthrough. I would also like to place a trigger warning here. There will be discussions of violence, death, and child abuse. If you're sensitive to these, please proceed with caution and take care of your mental health. With that being said, Mad Father is a horror game that came from the RPG Maker horror craze of 2012, even though the game was made on the Wolf RPG editor. It holds a complex plot through the eyes of a child that's merely 11 years old in the time frame the game gives us. The present plot and flashbacks give us a very good indicator of her home life and how she grew up, which is what we'll be talking about today. We're focusing primarily on the true end of the game, so this is the last call if you don't want any spoilers. Okay. In the true ending of this game, we see Aya working in a small clinic, and it's alluded that she's become much like her father, who, for all intents and purposes, was a mad scientist and a serial killer. We can conclude from the way that Aya speaks to her patient, her late father's assistant Maria's last words, and the dolls scattered about the back, that Aya's become very much like her father, a mad scientist. The subject of today will explain how a sweet, naive girl grows up to be a violent serial killer, even after the truth of her father had been shown to her. Let's start from the beginning. From a young age, Aya had some form of knowledge of what was happening in the basement where her father worked. She knew that people were being hurt. Her mother, not stopping it, showed Aya that this type of behavior was acceptable from her father. Later on, Aya finds that her father is cheating on her mother with Maria, and that makes her mother very angry. Eventually, her mother passes away, and she's left with a father who's obsessed with his work. Even in her early years, her father barely had time for her. We can see this in the flower crown cutscene, where he apologizes for not spending enough time with her. Until the present day beginning of the game, that would be the baseline for events up to this point. Even though her mother is by Aya's side through to her death, there are a few points here that lead to some type of trauma that Aya could have undergone in her formative years. Firstly, let's define trauma. There's a wide array of things that trauma could be an umbrella term for, but in most basic terms, it's an adverse event in one's life. It can include experiences like abuse of any type, violence against a parent, living with a substance abuser, living with someone who's mentally ill or suicidal, experiencing a severe accident, having a life-threatening illness, living through a disaster, or experiencing the death of someone close. Trauma in children around caretakers makes the relationship between the child and the parent unstable, and therefore makes the child insecure or disorganized in their thought processes. It can take form in a controlling nature, which can either take the form of hostile control or caregiving control. For Aya, it's the latter, especially after her mother dies. She cares deeply for her father and tries to reach out and care for him in any way she can. This insecurity, according to a study by Jake Greenberg, says that disorganized thought processes could be a risk that would increase the likelihood of future psychopathology. Even before we get to the present day of the game, we can see the effects of her father's absence and her mother's death on Aya herself. There are many symptoms I could go through, but I'm going to be focusing only on the ones that relate to Aya and her history before the events of the game. Fear. She's afraid of something happening to her father, thanks to the caregiver role she's put herself in with her disorganized thoughts. And even at the beginning of the game itself, she's checking up on her father. The caregiver role also creates distorted cognitions about others, events, the world, and traumatized victims themselves. Aya doesn't see her father's actions as deplorable. She doesn't understand when her mother was upset at her father over Maria, and she doesn't seem upset that her father doesn't spend enough time with her, merely acknowledging it. So as we see the prelude before the events of the game, Aya has already been subject to multiple traumas, both severe and not, with the knowledge of what her father is doing, the neglect of her father, and the loss of her mother being the most severe. However, there are even more severe traumas of her life that happen in the context of the present-day gameplay. At midnight, now the day of the anniversary of her mother's death, Aya wakes up hearing her father scream. She tries to go out and check on him, yet she's met with what she calls monsters, but later realizes that they are the spirits of the people that her father had brutally tortured and murdered, come back to life thanks to a curse. Seeing gruesome things like that alone would be a shock and immediate fear, along with the fact that she's completely alone through most of the story. She travels through her mansion, learning more and more of what's truly going on, helping the spirits find peace along the way. In an early game cutscene, we meet a man called Ogre, who questions why Aya would want to save such a disreputable and despicable man like her father, but Aya is firm in saving him. Her father is her last living relative, and one that she cares greatly for, despite what he's done. It's not until later in the game that we find Aya experiencing severe trauma in a very short amount of time. Having the spirits around her was enough, but to find that the curse that's plaguing her home was because of her mother, or even truly seeing her mother again in the first place, is cause for intense grief and an influx of emotion. To have her mother push her away from herself and her father would strengthen these feelings. However, it's not until the very end that we find the most severe trauma. Choosing the true end has Aya saving her father from her mother and sending her mother back to rest, another intense point of grief. Afterwards, her mother shows her the truth of what happened the day of her death. Aya's father wanted to make her into a doll, eternally beautiful, but dead. Outraged by this, her mother states that she's leaving with Aya in tow, and her father wouldn't allow his most precious doll to be taken away from him. In the memory, in front of Aya's eyes, her father brutally stabs her mother and proceeds to hide the evidence, marking it off as she died of illness. The loss of a parental figure is trauma enough for a small child, but seeing her mother murdered must have been terrible for Aya. But we aren't finished here. After a cutscene where she pushes away from her father and confronts him with what she knows, he seems to think he has no choice. Her own father chases her down with a chainsaw, intent on killing his own daughter to make her into a doll. If Aya is successful at escaping him, she watches as Maria attempts to kill him to save her. So, in less than an hour, Aya has seen her mother stabbed, has experienced her father trying to kill her, and then watched her father bleed out on the floor as Dio, a proponent of her late mother trying to protect Aya, gives her father a finishing blow. All of this incredibly severe abuse and trauma in the span of a night. As the mansion is set ablaze, we see Aya withdraw, seeming much different from the self we've seen throughout the game. She picks up her pet rabbit Snowball and a book she finds in the garden, before walking past Maria at a faster pace than usual. Aya even refrains from speaking on her feelings to her. Now that we've seen all the traumas and abuse Aya has been subjected to and overcame, let's go back to the true end of the game. Aya's become the doctor of a clinic, and thanks to the dialogue and visual cues, we can ascertain that she's become like her father, a mad scientist, telling her patient that she has the prettiest eyes and that she can't stop looking at them, and that she'll never have to suffer again. Maria states that Aya is much like her father and that it runs in the family. The dolls that are scattered in the back room away from the office space are also a visual clue that Aya has become like her father, as well as the book on anatomy that he loved so much resting on a table beside one of these dolls. It's fair to assume that this was the fate of Aya. However, what brought her to this point? There must be some rhyme or reason, right? I would love to explain. I would like to make one thing egregiously clear. Looking at most of the research I've found regarding childhood trauma, Aya's response to her trauma is most likely abnormal, or at the very least rare. Most cases of childhood trauma don't turn out the way Aya did. For most children, they're usually more anxious, depressed, and take a different route. Now, many children who are exposed to trauma are resilient, hardy, as Maria puts it. They return to normal functioning, and some may actually improve through something called post-traumatic growth. There are 5 domains of post-traumatic growth, but I'll only be looking at the ones that pertain to Aya specifically. Personal strength is one, as Aya realizes that she's stronger than she took herself for in the beginning. The next is new possibilities, which would be developing new interests, sometimes related to the trauma they experienced. This is specifically of note because of what Aya's become in her adult life. As for the other 3, they don't fit with Aya's perception, considering the rest of the list includes relating to others, appreciation for life, and spiritual change, which Aya certainly doesn't have in the last excerpt of the game. Childhood interpersonal trauma, as in trauma that comes from someone they trust, is detrimental to the development of a child. There are many consequences, but some include aggression, antisocial, schizotypal, and avoidant personality disorders, higher social isolation, and controlling behavior. In scientific literature, growing up in a violent home makes it to where experiencing intimate partner violence in adulthood, or in Aya's case, violence on the helpless, is 2 to 4 times more likely to happen. One of the biggest theories to explain violence that spans from one generation to another is the social learning theory, which says that through behavioral conditioning, modeling, and observational learning, children raised with violence will think violence is an appropriate response to conflict. This does raise a brow, considering that Aya knew from a very young age that her father was doing bad things down in the basement, with her mother reinforcing the thought that it was okay, or at least acceptable. It sets the stage for the social learning theory. Adding to that, children who have undergone trauma include low emotional awareness and difficulties with emotional learning, and can also be associated with psychotic experiences. We're not quite moving on from childhood abuse, but we're going to look at it in a different perspective. Since Aya has become like her father, it would be safe to assume that she's a criminal at best and a serial killer at worst, preying on the weak to be able to continue her father's studies. Therefore, I thought it was fitting to dive into some criminology to see if child trauma or abuse would be linked to criminal acts. While the reports and analytics are few and far between, I still found a few good studies to shine a light on Aya's predicament. Even in articles from just this year, 2020, Psychologists and criminologists are still trying to figure out what makes one person go on to be a serial killer and not another. After all, in Michael Newton's book, The Encyclopedia of Serial Killers from the year 2000, states that there's an estimate of around 1,500 serial killers in all of history. So it's pretty hard to gather data on something so rare. However, some research does, in fact, exist. John Wayne Gacy, Carrie Ridgway, and Ed Gein are all infamous serial killers who were abused in some way as children by a parent. Trauma in childhood makes a bigger risk for antisocial behaviors, personality disorders, and criminality later in life. Rebecca Taylor Lebrow wrote in her paper, Etiology of the Psychopathic Killer, that other historical factors common in serial killers are abuse, trauma, insecure attachment, loss or abandonment of a parent or caretaker, antisocial behavior, head injury, and low arousal levels. To be fair, Aya has had at least half of the items listed happen to her, some in early childhood, and some on the anniversary of her mother's death. With her mother pushing her back so hard, and other times where she's fallen, I wouldn't be surprised if she were concussed, but I digress. Let's check out a handy graph. This shows childhood abuse victims in the general public versus serial killers. Now, for the general public, it's said that this number may not be accurate, but instead grossly underreported, and serial killers' words should be taken with some caution. The rate of psychological abuse was 2% in the general public, but 50% in the serial killer group studied. The authors claimed that organized killers were the most likely to have such psychological abuse in their history. When I say organized killer, I'm referring to a typology developed by the FBI that pertains to what a crime scene looks like, and, in turn, how that person thinks and acts. An organized killer is thought to lead an average life, having average or above average intelligence, skilled employment, and socially competent. This type of killer is cunning and skillful, making sure that the crime scene is left clean and empty of evidence, like fingerprints, blood, or a murder weapon. As we can see, Aya's clinic is spotless, with no blood or evidence of what she's doing anywhere, which would allow us to lean more towards the organized killer category, and therefore has most likely suffered psychological abuse, which she most undoubtedly has. This isn't the only factor in what made Aya the way she was, though. Criminologist Dr. Adrian Rain wrote in his book, The Anatomy of Violence, that genetics and environment work together to encourage violent behavior. Genetics, along with environmental factors like a violent childhood, work together to shape a person. In other words, Aya was predisposed at birth to have a slight possibility of her becoming this way. A fine example is her not even reacting to the corpse of a cat in her bedside drawer. It was a very odd reaction. No reaction at all. When I'm sure most 11-year-old girls would either shy away, shriek, or cry at the thought of an animal dead in their room, especially since she has a pet rabbit, Snowball. However, the effects of her trauma from her history, then throughout the game, merely heightened her chances for becoming what she is, a psychopath. With stunted emotions, an inability to feel any guilt, remorse, or empathy, superficial charm, and pathological lying, she has become what she originally hated to see. Thanks to her childhood trauma, and possibly genetics, Aya was driven onto a psychopathic route. She feels no connection to others, possibly with the exception being Maria, and no appreciation for the lives of others, no remorse for what she's doing. It's sad to see, but in very rare cases, it does happen. The experiences Aya has gone through are horrendous, and something I think we all wouldn't wish on any child. But let me be clear, that does not excuse her for the despicable things she's doing now in her adulthood. Aya's story is a sad, grim truth on a very rare effect of childhood trauma and abuse, and something I personally hope has more light shed on in the future, so that we may have a better understanding of it, and to possibly prevent future deplorable crime from happening. There are buffers that help children who have suffered through trauma and abuse, and I'm at least certainly glad for those. That's the end of Aya's story, and my look into the reason why she came to such a grim conclusion. I hope to see you next week with another analysis. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you wish to discuss what has been said, feel free to leave a comment. If you wish to see more of these analytical, psychological deep dives on video game characters, subscribe maybe. I do have a social media that you can see here. For now, please take care of yourself. If you have children, nieces or nephews, grandchildren, godchildren, make sure they're doing well and are happy. Tell them that you love them. Please take care of yourself as well. Make sure you tend to your mental health as much as you can in these trying times. Until next time.